Routine ultrasound turns shocking as the doctors discover she is carrying 11 babies. What does this mean for her? And the babies? What complications would unfold and would she overcome it? But first, please subscribe to my channel to get more of my stories. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, the sterile scent of the hospital sharp and unnerving. Marissa shifted uncomfortably on the examination table, her paper gown crinkling with every movement. She clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles white as she scanned the room for a clue. Any clue that would tell her what was happening. The ultrasound technician, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and an inscrutable expression, had excused herself 20 minutes ago after a brief, tense exchange with the doctor. "Is everything okay?" Marissa had asked nervously when she noticed their hushed tones and darting eyes. The doctor had given her a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just need to double-check a few things. Stay put. We'll be back soon." Marissa's heart was a drumbeat of dread, her stomach twisting in knots. Her husband, Ethan, was sitting stiffly in the corner of the room, his face pale and lined with worry. He hadn't said a word since they arrived at the hospital, though he'd squeezed her hand reassuringly before they called her in. Now, he looked like a statue, his hands clasped tightly between his knees, his jaw locked. She thought back to the last few weeks. She was no stranger to pregnancy. This was her 5th child. But something had been different this time. Her belly had ballooned rapidly, far more than she'd expected for someone only in her 2nd trimester. Her ankles were swollen to the size of grapefruits, and the constant fatigue was unlike anything she'd experienced before. Then there were the strange flutters, stronger and more chaotic than any movement she'd felt with her other pregnancies. Still, she'd chalked it up to being older this time around, and the relentless stress of trying to make ends meet. Ethan had been working double shifts at the warehouse, and she'd taken on extra cleaning jobs to supplement their income. Their small house was already bursting at the seams, but they'd been hopeful, counting on the joy a new baby would bring to their struggling family. The door creaked open, and the technician returned, followed closely by the doctor and 2 other people, a younger man in a white coat and a stern-looking woman in scrubs. Marissa's pulse quickened as she sat up straighter, gripping the edges of the table. "Mrs. Jacobs," the doctor began, his voice carefully measured. "We've reviewed the ultrasound results, and we need to discuss something important with you." Marissa's mouth went dry. "Is the baby okay?" she blurted out, her voice cracking. "Is there something wrong?" The doctor exchanged a glance with the younger man, who nodded slightly. "The baby, or rather, the babies, are alive and developing," he said cautiously. "But your case is highly unusual. We've never seen anything quite like this." "Babies?" Ethan finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "As in, more than one?" "Yes," the doctor said, his gaze steady but somber. "Marissa, you're carrying 11 babies." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Marissa stared at him, her brain scrambling to make sense of what she'd just heard. 11? That couldn't be right. That wasn't possible. "What?" she managed to choke out. No, there has to be some mistake. That's impossible." "We double-checked the scans multiple times," the doctor said gently. "There's no mistake. It's an extremely rare condition called superfetation, where multiple embryos are conceived during separate ovulation cycles. In your case, it's resulted in 11 fetuses." Marissa felt the room tilt, her vision swimming as her breath came in short, panicked gasps. Ethan rushed to her side, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Breathe, honey," he murmured, though his own voice was shaking. "Just breathe." "How is that even—" Marissa trailed off, pressing a trembling hand to her stomach. She thought of the relentless fluttering, the rapid growth, the sheer exhaustion. It all made a horrifying kind of sense now. What does this mean for the babies? For me? The stern woman in scrubs stepped forward. "It means this is a very high-risk pregnancy," she said bluntly. "Your body isn't designed to carry this many fetuses at once. There's a significant risk of complications, preterm labor, gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, and more. We'll need to monitor you very closely." Tears welled in Marissa's eyes as fear clawed at her chest. "But they'll be okay," right? You can do something to keep them safe? The doctor hesitated, and Marissa felt her heart plummet. We'll do everything we can, he said carefully. But there are no guarantees. Carrying 11 babies is unprecedented. We'll need to make some very difficult decisions as things progress. Ethan wrapped his arms around her as she began to sob, her tears soaking into his shirt. We'll get through this, he said fiercely, though his voice was thick with emotion. We'll figure it out. I promise. Marissa wasn't so sure. How could they get through this when they could barely afford to feed the children they already had? How would her body withstand the strain of carrying so many lives at once? And most terrifying of all, how could she possibly face the prospect of losing any of them? The doctor cleared his throat, his expression softening. For now, we'll admit you to the hospital for observation and run some additional tests. We'll also bring in a team of specialists to help manage your care. Marissa nodded numbly, too overwhelmed to speak. As the medical staff busied themselves with preparations, she stared down at her swollen belly, her mind spinning with questions and fears. 11 babies. 11 lives depending on her to keep them safe. The weight of it all was suffocating. But deep beneath the fear, a tiny spark of determination flickered. She didn't know how, but she would fight for her babies. She had to. The rest of that day was a blur for Marissa. Nurses came and went, their faces kind, but their expressions carefully neutral, as if they were afraid to reveal just how grave her situation was. She was wheeled into a private room, a luxury she'd never dreamed of affording, though it didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like isolation, an island of uncertainty where every beep of the monitors and every whisper in the hallway carried a new wave of dread. Ethan stayed by her side, though he'd grown quieter as the hours stretched on. She could see the strain in his face, the deep furrows in his brow that hadn't been there that morning. When he finally stepped out to take a call, probably from his boss, since he hadn't been able to give any notice for missing work, Marissa was left alone with her thoughts. She stared at the ceiling, the sterile white tiles a harsh contrast to the storm of emotions inside her. Her hands rested on her belly, trembling slightly as she felt the faint, chaotic flutters beneath her skin. 11 babies. It still didn't seem real. How could it be? It was the kind of thing you heard about on the news or in some bizarre medical journal, not something that happened to people like her. A knock on the door broke her reverie, and she turned to see a woman in a dark blue blazer stepping inside. Her sharp eyes scanned the room before landing on Marissa with a practiced smile. Mrs. Jacobs, the woman said, closing the door softly behind her. My name is Caroline Marks. I'm a social worker here at the hospital. The doctors asked me to come and speak with you. Marissa sat up slightly, her pulse quickening. Why? She asked, her voice thin. Is something wrong? Are the babies? No, Caroline interrupted, holding up a hand. This is just a precaution. With such a high-risk pregnancy, we want to make sure you have all the resources and support you need moving forward. Support. The word felt hollow, almost mocking. Marissa and Ethan had spent their entire marriage scraping by, leaning on food stamps and community aid when things got especially tight. The idea of more support sounded like another way to say they'd be on their own. I don't know what kind of resources you think we'll need, Marissa said, her voice shaking, but we can barely afford the ones we already have. Caroline's expression softened, and she pulled up a chair beside the bed. I won't sugarcoat this, Marissa. What you're facing is extraordinary, and it's going to be a challenge in every way, physically, emotionally, financially, but there are programs that can help. We can look into housing assistance, childcare support, even emergency funding if necessary. Marissa wanted to laugh, but the sound caught in her throat, turning into a strangled sob. You don't understand, she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. We already live paycheck to paycheck. We don't even have enough space for the kids we have, let alone 11 more. How are we supposed to do this? Caroline reached out, placing a comforting hand on Marissa's arm. You're not alone in this, she said gently. We're here to help you every step of the way. But you need to take it one day at a time. Right now, the most important thing is your health and the health of your babies. Marissa nodded reluctantly, though the knot in her chest didn't loosen. one day at a time. It sounded so simple, but the enormity of the future loomed over her like a tidal wave, threatening to drag her under. The door opened again, and Ethan returned, his face pale and drawn. "They're asking me to come back to work tomorrow," he said quietly, his eyes flicking to Marissa. "I told them I couldn't. Not yet." Marissa's heart sank. Ethan couldn't afford to lose his job, not with everything they were about to face. But what choice did they have? She needed him here, and the thought of being alone in this nightmare was unbearable. Caroline stood, smoothing her blazer. "I'll leave you two to talk," she said, her voice brisk but kind. "If you need anything, just let the nurses know. I'll check in again tomorrow." As the door clicked shut behind her, Marissa reached for Ethan's hand, her fingers tightening around his like a lifeline. "What are we going to do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan knelt beside her, resting his forehead against her hand. "We'll figure it out," he said, though his voice cracked under the weight of his own uncertainty. "We have to." The hours bled into night, and Marissa found herself drifting in and out of restless sleep, her dreams a chaotic mix of crying babies, hospital monitors, and shadowy figures whispering ominously in the background. She woke with a start around midnight, her heart racing as she realized the fluttering in her belly had grown stronger, more insistent. It wasn't just one movement. It was a cacophony, a chaotic symphony of tiny lives fighting for space inside her. Panic clawed at her chest as she reached for the call button. A nurse appeared moments later, her face calm but alert, as she checked the monitors and listened to Marissa's frantic explanation. "You know, it's normal to feel more movement with a pregnancy like this," the nurse reassured her, though her brow furrowed slightly as she glanced at the readouts. "But we'll run some tests just to be safe." Marissa nodded, swallowing hard as the nurse disappeared into the hallway. She looked down at her swollen belly, her hands trembling as she pressed them against the taut skin. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Just stay with me. All of you. Please." The morning light filtered through the thin hospital curtains as Marissa sat upright in her bed, cradling a styrofoam cup of lukewarm tea in her trembling hands. The night had been long, filled with more fluttering movements and strange, almost rhythmic kicks that made it impossible to rest. Ethan sat slumped in the chair beside her, his head tilted back and his arms crossed as he snored softly. A soft knock at the door startled her. She glanced up to see a trio of doctors entering, their faces grim. Leading the group was Dr. Patel, the obstetrician overseeing her care. Beside him was the maternal fetal medicine specialist, Dr. Nguyen, and a neonatologist, Dr. Harper. Marissa's stomach twisted. The presence of all three doctors at once couldn't be good news. She set her tea down on the tray table and nudged Ethan awake. He blinked groggily, sitting up straighter as the doctors pulled up chairs and sat across from them. "Marissa, Ethan," Dr. Patel began, his tone gentle but laced with urgency. "We need to have a serious conversation about your pregnancy and the best course of action moving forward." Marissa's pulse quickened, and her hands instinctively went to her belly. "Is something wrong? Are the babies okay?" Dr. Nguyen leaned forward, her expression soft but direct. "At this moment, all 11 fetuses are alive and developing. However, your body is under incredible strain. The sheer number of fetuses combined with the limited space in your uterus is creating significant risks, not only for the babies, but for you as well." Ethan frowned, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "What are you saying? What kind of risks?" Dr. Harper, the neonatologist, took a deep breath. "We're already seeing signs of potential complications. The rapid growth of the fetuses is crowding your organs, putting immense pressure on your heart and lungs. Additionally, there's a high likelihood of placental insufficiency, which means some of the babies might not be getting the nutrients and oxygen they need to survive." Marissa felt the blood drain from her face. "But they're still okay right now, aren't they? Can't we just wait and see?" Dr. Patel shook his head. "Unfortunately, waiting is not a viable option. The longer this pregnancy continues, the greater the risk of severe complications for both you and the babies. That's why we're recommending that we deliver them early, at the start of your 3rd trimester." Marissa's heart sank. "But that's too soon," she whispered, her voice cracking. They won't survive that early. Dr. Harper's expression was kind but firm. It's true that delivery at this stage carries significant risks. Premature birth is always a challenge, especially for babies this young. However, with the advancements in neonatal care, many babies born at 28 weeks can survive and thrive with proper medical support. Keeping them inside you any longer, though, may decrease those odds dramatically. Ethan leaned forward, his voice tight with emotion. What happens if we wait? What happens if we try to let them grow a little more? Dr. Nguyen exchanged a glance with Dr. Patel before answering. If we wait, the risks include preeclampsia, organ failure, and even death for both Marissa and the babies. The strain on her body is already reaching dangerous levels. Additionally, the longer the fetuses remain crowded, the more likely they are to suffer from growth restrictions, developmental issues, or stillbirth. The words hit Marissa like a sledgehammer. She pressed her hands to her belly, tears streaming down her face. I just want to give them a chance, she said, her voice trembling. I want to do what's best for them. And that's exactly what we're trying to ensure, Dr. Patel said gently. Delivering them early gives them the best chance of survival and gives us the ability to intervene medically in ways we can't while they're still in utero. Marissa looked at Ethan, her vision blurred with tears. He reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. What does this mean for her? He asked, his voice cracking. For her recovery? Dr. Nguyen gave a measured nod. It's a major surgery. A delivery like this will require a complex cesarean section, and Marissa will need time to recover physically. There's also the emotional toll to consider. Delivering so early and facing the uncertainties of neonatal care can be incredibly difficult. Marissa swallowed hard, her chest aching with the weight of the decision. She looked down at her belly, feeling the flurry of tiny movements beneath her hands. Each kick, each flutter felt like a plea for survival. When would the surgery happen? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Patel adjusted his glasses. We'd aim for 28 weeks, which is just 2 weeks away. In the meantime, we'll focus on keeping you stable, administering steroids to help the baby's lungs develop, and preparing the neonatal intensive care unit to support their arrival. 2 weeks. The words rang in her ears like a countdown to an impossible choice. She glanced at Ethan, who was staring at the floor, his jaw clenched. She knew he was trying to stay strong for her, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. I don't know if I can do this, she admitted, her voice breaking. What if I lose them? Dr. Harper leaned closer, her tone warm and reassuring. Marissa, you've already done so much for them. The fact that they've made it this far is a testament to your strength. But now it's time for us to help carry the load. We'll do everything in our power to keep you and your babies safe. Marissa closed her eyes, her tears falling freely. She felt Ethan's hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her as she tried to steady her breathing. 2 weeks. It wasn't enough time to prepare for something like this, but it was all the time they had. Marissa's hospital room was a revolving door of medical staff, nurses checking her vitals, doctors explaining procedures, and technicians wheeling in machines she couldn't even name. It was exhausting, but the focus on logistics kept her from spiraling too deeply into her fears. That tenuous calm shattered when she heard the unmistakable chatter of familiar voices down the hallway. A moment later, the door swung open, and her best friends, Clara and Tanya, spilled into the room. They were carrying a mismatched collection of items, a bouquet of supermarket flowers, a plastic bag of snacks, and a crumpled magazine. Surprise! Clara sang, her eyes sparkling as she set the flowers on the bedside table. We come bearing gifts and gossip. Tanya, the quieter of the two, gave Marissa a softer smile. We figured you could use some company, she said, placing the snacks on the tray table. Hospital food is a crime. Marissa managed a weak laugh, her chest tightening at the sight of them. She hadn't expected visitors, especially not her oldest friends, and the sudden wave of emotion was almost too much to bear. You guys didn't have to come all the way out here. Oh, hush, Clara said, pulling a chair close to the bed. Like we'd stay away after hearing the news. 11 babies, Marissa? You're practically a medical miracle. Tanya nodded, her brow furrowing, But also, that's gotta be terrifying. How are you holding up? Marissa hesitated, glancing at the monitors beeping steadily beside her. How could she even begin to answer that? It's a lot, she admitted finally. They're talking about delivering them in 2 weeks. It feels like a ticking clock. Clara reached out and squeezed her hand. You're the strongest person I know. If anyone can handle this, it's you. Marissa wanted to believe her, but the weight of everything, her body stretched to its limit, the financial strain, the constant uncertainty, made her doubt herself more with each passing day. As Clara launched into a story about a disastrous blind date she'd set up for her cousin, Marissa felt herself relax slightly, the warmth of her friend's presence a welcome distraction. But then the conversation took a turn she wasn't ready for. You know, Clara said casually, flipping through the magazine she'd brought. People are going to want to hear about this. 11 babies? You could probably sell your story to a news outlet and make some serious money. Marissa froze. Sell my story? Sure, Clara continued, oblivious to the tension creeping into the room. You're a sensation waiting to happen. Interviews, maybe even a documentary. Imagine what that could do for you and Ethan. It could cover the hospital bills, help with the kids. It's not like anyone would blame you for cashing in. Tanya's eyes widened, and she shot Clara a warning glance. Clara, maybe now isn't the time. No, I want to hear this, Marissa interrupted, her voice tight. You think I should put my life on display for strangers? Turn my babies into a spectacle? Clara blinked, taken aback by the edge in Marissa's tone. I didn't mean it like that, You're struggling, Mar. This could be a way out. A way out? Marissa repeated, her voice rising. Do you think I'm not already doing everything I can to keep us afloat? Ethan and I are barely hanging on, and now you're suggesting I turn my pregnancy into some kind of sideshow? Clara opened her mouth to respond, but Tanya cut in, her voice firm. Clara, I think we need to back off. This is Marissa's life, and she doesn't need pressure from us on top of everything else. The room fell silent, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Marissa looked down at her hands, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the blanket. I know you meant well, she said finally, her voice trembling. But this isn't just a story to sell. These are my babies, my family. I won't let anyone reduce them to a headline. Clara's face softened, guilt flickering in her eyes. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I didn't mean to upset you. I just hate seeing you struggle. Marissa nodded, though the knot in her chest didn't loosen. I appreciate that, but right now, all I need is for you to be here. Just be my friends. Tanya reached out and placed a hand on Marissa's shoulder. We're here, she said softly. No strings, no expectations. Just here. The room grew quieter, the earlier laughter and lightness replaced by a solemn understanding. As the hours passed, Clara and Tanya stayed by her side, their presence a balm for the growing storm inside her. But as the door closed behind them later that evening, Marissa couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Clara's words had stirred. Could they really survive this without outside help? And if not, how far was she willing to go to save her family? The question lingered, heavy and unanswered, as the 2-week countdown marched relentlessly on. 2 days after Clara and Tanya's visit, Marissa was propped up in her hospital bed, absently watching a muted talk show on the tiny television mounted in the corner. She was too tired to focus, her body weighed down by the relentless strain of carrying 11 babies. Ethan sat across the room, his laptop balanced on his knees as he scrolled through job boards. Their silence was companionable but heavy, both of them lost in their own thoughts, trying not to let the worry spill over. The knock at the door startled them both. Marissa looked up to see a sharply dressed woman with sleek brown hair step into the room, her smile professional but warm. She was followed by a man carrying a camera bag slung over one shoulder. Mrs. Jacobs, the woman began, holding out a business card. I'm Paige Sanders with the local news. We'd love the opportunity to share your story. Marissa froze, her heart thudding painfully. What? Who? How did you even know? Clara, Ethan interjected, his tone sharp as he rose to his feet. He grabbed the card from Paige's outstretched hand, his eyes narrowing as he read it. You talked to Clara. Paige didn't flinch under his glare. Yes, she reached out to us. She thought your story might inspire others and help raise awareness about the challenges you're facing. Marissa's stomach churned with a mix of anger and betrayal. Clara had meant well, she was sure of that. But this felt like a violation. A spotlight thrown onto a moment that was already too big and too bright for her to handle. No, she said firmly, her voice stronger than she felt. I'm not doing this. This is private. It's not for the world to see. Paige's expression softened. I understand your hesitation. But we're not here to sensationalize this, I promise. We want to tell your story with compassion and integrity. This could be an opportunity to shine a light on the difficulties of high-risk pregnancies, to educate people, and, most importantly, to bring support to your family. Ethan glanced at Marissa, his jaw tight. We don't need support from strangers. We'll figure this out on our own. Paige nodded slowly. I respect that. But if you change your mind, we're here. And for what it's worth, you've already inspired someone. Clara told us about your strength, your resilience. She believes in you, and she wanted the world to know why. With that, Paige handed the card to Ethan and left, the cameraman trailing silently behind her. The door clicked shut, leaving Marissa and Ethan in a tense silence. Marissa clenched the blanket in her fists, her voice trembling. I can't believe she did this. How could Clara think this was okay? Ethan sighed, sitting down beside her. She's trying to help in her own way. It was wrong, yeah, but maybe she's not completely off base. Marissa stared at him, her heart sinking. You're not seriously considering this, are you? Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, his expression conflicted. Mar, look at where we are. Look at what we're up against. 11 babies, hospital bills we can't even imagine, and that's before they're even born. This could actually help us. If it means giving them a better shot at life, is it really so bad? Her chest tightened, a swell of anger and panic rising within her. So what? We turn our babies into a spectacle? Let the whole world watch me struggle and judge us for every decision we make? It's not about them, Ethan said firmly. It's about us, about giving those babies the best chance we can. If telling our story means we get the support we need, then maybe it's worth it. Marissa looked away, her vision blurring with tears. The thought of letting strangers into their lives felt like giving up some small piece of herself, her dignity, her privacy. But Ethan's words burrowed into her mind, the weight of their reality pressing harder against her. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered. Ethan leaned forward, taking her hand in his. You're already doing the impossible, he said softly. This isn't about giving up. It's about fighting smarter. And I'll be with you every step of the way. Marissa swallowed hard, her resolve crumbling under the sheer weight of his quiet conviction. She didn't want this. But Ethan was right. They couldn't do it alone. Fine, she said finally, her voice shaking. We'll do the interview, but only if they promise to focus on the babies, not me. Ethan nodded, relief flickering across his face. We'll make sure of it. I'll handle it. The next day, Paige returned with her cameraman and a producer. They set up a small interview space in the hospital room, asking soft, open-ended questions about Marissa's journey. Despite her initial resistance, Marissa found herself opening up, talking about the fear, the hope, and the overwhelming love she already felt for the 11 tiny lives inside her. When the interview aired a week later, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Offers of support poured in from around the country, donations, baby supplies, and even specialists volunteering to assist with the high-risk delivery. 2 days before the scheduled surgery, Paige returned with a proposal. Would Marissa and Ethan allow the birth to be filmed for a special documentary? It would be handled with care, focusing on the medical team's efforts and the incredible challenges of bringing 11 babies into the world. Marissa hesitated, her heart pounding. But Ethan squeezed her hand, his voice steady. This is their story too, Mar. Maybe it's time we let the world see it. After a long, tearful night of talking it through, Marissa agreed. Fine, she said, her voice trembling. But they don't get everything. No cameras in the room until the babies are out. After that, they can have their story. Ethan pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. We'll do this together, he promised. The countdown to delivery loomed large, but for the first time, Marissa felt something new. Hope. The delivery day arrived far sooner than Marissa had anticipated, despite the countdown she had been dreading. The hospital room was abuzz with activity from the early hours of the morning. Doctors, nurses, and technicians came and went, checking monitors, setting up equipment, and reviewing plans. Marissa lay on the bed, staring up at the sterile ceiling tiles, her heart pounding in her chest. Ethan sat beside her, his hand tightly gripping hers. You're going to be okay, he whispered, though his voice wavered. We're going to meet our babies today. Marissa nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. I'm scared, Ethan, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. What if something goes wrong? Ethan leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. Nothing's going to happen to you, he said firmly. I won't let it. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Patel entered, his face serious but calm. Marissa, Ethan, he began. We're ready to begin. The operating room is prepped, and the neonatal teams are standing by. I won't sugarcoat this. It's going to be a long, complicated procedure. But we're ready for anything. Marissa swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around Ethan's. She nodded. Okay, she said, her voice trembling. Let's do this. The journey to the operating room felt like a dream, or a nightmare. The fluorescent lights above her blurred as the gurney rolled down the hallway, her heart hammering louder with each step closer. Ethan followed closely, holding her hand until the surgical team stopped him outside the sterile barrier. You'll see her and the babies as soon as we're done, a nurse reassured him. He nodded, his jaw clenched as he reluctantly let go of Marissa's hand. Inside the operating room, the atmosphere was tense but professional. Machines beeped in the background, and the medical staff spoke in low, precise tones. Marissa's body felt heavy and distant as the epidural took effect, her lower half numb but her mind racing. Dr. Patel appeared above her, his face framed by a surgical mask. We're going to start now, Marissa. Just keep breathing and let us do the work. She nodded weakly, her breath hitching as she stared at the ceiling, trying to block out the sounds of scalpels and suction. The first incision sent a wave of pressure through her body, and the medical team moved with coordinated urgency. One baby out, a nurse called. Marissa felt tears stream down her face. Is the baby okay? She asked, her voice trembling. Baby's in good hands, Dr. Harper, the neonatologist, reassured her from the other side of the room. Stable and breathing. The process continued, each baby carefully removed and handed off to waiting specialists. The room was filled with the sound of tiny, fragile cries, each one piercing Marissa's heart with a mix of relief and fear. Baby 4. Baby 5. The count climbed steadily. Marissa clung to the voices, grounding herself in the hope that they were all still alive. But as the 8th baby was delivered, something shifted. Marissa felt a strange, overwhelming wave of dizziness. Her vision blurred, and she struggled to breathe. Pressure's dropping, one of the nurses called out. Marissa heard the panic in their voices, though she couldn't make out the words. Her body felt like it was sinking, her heart pounding erratically in her chest. She's hemorrhaging, Dr. Patel said sharply. Massive blood loss. Get the crash cart in here now. Marissa's head lolled to the side, her vision tunneling. The edges of the room grew dark as she heard the frantic rustle of fabric and clatter of instruments. Marissa, stay with us! Dr. Patel's voice was distant, muffled. We're going to get this under control. Hang on. Somewhere in the chaos, she thought of Ethan, his face, his voice, his steady presence that had carried her through so much. She thought of her other children, waiting for her at home. She thought of the babies she hadn't yet met, their tiny cries fading into the distance. Ethan, she whispered, though she wasn't sure if the words ever left her lips. The world went dark. When Marissa woke, the room was silent except for the faint hum of machines. Her body felt like lead, and every breath came with effort. She blinked slowly, her vision adjusting to the dim light. The first thing she saw was Ethan, his face buried in his hands as he sat by her bedside. His shoulders were shaking. "Ethan?" she croaked, her voice weak and dry. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with tears. In an instant, he was by her side, clutching her hand as though afraid she might disappear again. "Marissa," he choked out. "You're awake. Oh my God, you're awake." She tried to smile, though her lips barely moved. "The babies?" she asked, fear gripping her chest. "They're alive," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "All of them. They're in the NICU. The doctors. They worked miracles, Mar. You almost didn't make it." Marissa's breath hitched as the memories came flooding back. The chaos, the blood, the sensation of slipping away. "What happened?" she whispered. "You hemorrhaged," Ethan explained, his voice trembling. "They said it was touch and go for hours. You lost so much blood, but they managed to stabilize you. Dr. Patel said, he said you're a fighter." Tears streamed down Marissa's face as the weight of it all hit her. She had come so close to leaving her family behind, to never holding the 11 tiny lives she had fought so hard to bring into the world. "I want to see them," she said, her voice cracking. "The babies. I need to see them." Ethan nodded, his grip on her hand tightening. "You will," he promised, "as soon as you're strong enough." Marissa closed her eyes, her heart aching with a mix of relief and exhaustion. She had made it. They had all made it. But she knew the fight was far from over. Marissa's recovery was slow but steady, each day bringing her closer to the life she had fought so desperately to hold on to. Her body felt battered, and there were moments when the exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, but the thought of her 11 tiny miracles kept her going. The babies, each weighing barely more than a pound, were in the NICU under constant care. Monitors beeped steadily around them, and Marissa cried the first time she saw their fragile forms tucked into incubators, their tiny hands grasping at the air. As the weeks passed, word of her extraordinary story spread like wildfire. The hospital was inundated with media requests, and soon Marissa and Ethan found themselves at the center of a national phenomenon. Their first exclusive interview with Paige Sanders had gone viral, sparking an outpouring of support from around the world. Donations flooded in: money, diapers, clothes, formula, and even offers to help with childcare. It was overwhelming but deeply humbling. Marissa's hospital room became a revolving door once again, this time with visitors who came bearing gifts and well-wishes. Celebrities sent messages of support, charities reached out with resources, and people from every corner of the country wrote letters expressing their admiration and awe. One day, as Marissa sat in her hospital bed scrolling through messages on her new tablet, a gift from a tech company, Ethan burst into the room, his face flushed with excitement. "You're not going to believe this," he said, waving a piece of paper in his hand. "We just got an invitation to the White House. The president wants to meet us." Marissa blinked, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "The president?" she repeated, her voice incredulous. "Are you serious?" Ethan grinned, sitting beside her and handing her the letter. "Completely serious. He wants to honor us for our resilience, courage, and contribution to inspiring the nation. There's even a gala." Marissa's heart swelled with disbelief and pride. Never in her wildest dreams could she have imagined this, a poor mother from a struggling family being invited to the White House because of her babies. A month later, after Marissa had regained enough strength to leave the hospital, they made the trip to Washington, D.C. The babies remained in the NICU, under the watchful eyes of their medical team, while Marissa and Ethan took part in what felt like a whirlwind dream. The President and First Lady greeted them personally, shaking their hands and expressing admiration for their strength and determination. "This country is built on stories like yours," the President said warmly. "You've shown us all what it means to fight for family, no matter the odds." The evening was filled with speeches, photographs, and applause. Marissa found herself seated next to philanthropists and dignitaries who pledged their support to ensure her family had everything they needed. By the end of the night, a foundation had been created in her name to assist families facing high-risk pregnancies. The money and resources changed their lives overnight. They moved out of their cramped house into a spacious, custom-built home donated by a charitable organization. It had enough room for all 11 babies, a nursery equipped with everything they could possibly need, and even a playroom for their older children. Ethan quit his warehouse job, finally able to focus on being there for his family full-time. Months later, when all 11 babies had grown strong enough to leave the NICU, the media attention reached its peak. The nation waited eagerly to hear the names Marissa and Ethan had chosen for their miraculous brood. A special live broadcast was arranged, the cameras capturing the family as they stood in front of their new home. Marissa cradled two of the babies in her arms, her smile radiant despite the fatigue still lingering in her eyes. Ethan held three, while the older children helped with the others, beaming with pride. The crowd watching was silent, the anticipation palpable. "We've thought long and hard about this," Marissa began, her voice steady but emotional. "These names are a reflection of the hope, love, and strength that carried us through the hardest time of our lives." She began naming them one by one, her voice breaking slightly as she spoke. Grace, for the strength I never knew I had. Faith, for believing when everything seemed impossible. Hope, for the light that guided us through the darkness. Joy, for the happiness these babies have brought into our lives. Ethan Jr., for my husband, my rock. Serenity, for the peace I feel now when I look at them. Victor, for the battles we fought and won. Amara, which means everlasting, because their love will last forever. Luke, for the kindness of everyone who helped us along the way. Harper, for the doctor who saved their lives. And finally, Miracle, because that's what they all are. As she finished, tears streamed down her face, and the crowd erupted in applause. The cameras zoomed in on the babies, their tiny faces a testament to resilience and love. In that moment, Marissa knew she had made it. The road ahead would still be hard, but with her family by her side and a world cheering them on, she felt ready for anything. Her story had become a beacon of hope, and her 11 little miracles were a reminder of the extraordinary things love and determination could achieve.